all my years of serving God, I have witnessed many mysteries of His creation, but nothing prepared me for the trial that would test my faith to its very foundation. What transpired in the wilderness of northern Oregon challenges everything I thought I understood about God's creatures and His divine protection. I feel compelled to record these events not for sensational purposes, but as a testament to the Lord's providence in the face of unimaginable terror. I live alone in the mountains of northern Oregon, about 30 miles from the nearest town. I'm an Orthodox priest, and I chose this life of solitude deliberately. My little cabin sits in a clearing surrounded by old-growth forest, with just enough open space for a small farm and my animals. It's the perfect place for prayer and contemplation, or at least it was until 3 weeks ago. My daily routine has been the same for the past 4 years. I wake before dawn for morning prayers, tend to my small garden, care for my chickens, goats, and my one horse. The afternoons are spent in study and more prayer, and I usually end my day with evening prayers as the sun sets behind the towering pine trees. It's a simple life, but it's exactly what I needed after years of serving in busy urban parishes. The first sign that something was different happened on a Tuesday morning in early September. I was walking the perimeter of my property, something I do every few days to check the fence line and just enjoy God's creation. The morning mist was still clinging to the forest floor when I noticed something that made me stop dead in my tracks. There, pressed deep into the soft earth near the creek that runs along my eastern boundary, was a footprint. But this wasn't from any animal I recognized. It was enormous, easily 18 inches long and 7 inches wide, with what looked like 5 distinct toe impressions. The depth of the print suggested whatever made it was incredibly heavy. I stood there staring at it for several minutes, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was a bear print that had been distorted by rain or settling mud, but bears don't leave prints that look anything like this. This looked almost human, but impossibly large. I said a quick prayer and continued my walk, but I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something was watching me from the tree line. Every few steps, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, but I never saw anything except the familiar darkness between the massive tree trunks. Over the next few days, I tried to put the strange footprint out of my mind. I focused on my prayers and my daily routine, telling myself it was probably just a freak impression left by some ordinary forest animal, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. During my evening prayers, I found myself asking God for understanding. Was this perhaps the beginning of some spiritual trial? The Desert Fathers wrote extensively about the strange visions and encounters that came to test their faith during their periods of isolation. I recalled the words of St. Anthony, who wrote that the devil often appears to hermits in frightening forms to shake their resolve. Perhaps this was my time of testing, a challenge sent to strengthen my faith through adversity. The thought both comforted and unsettled me. If this was indeed a spiritual battle, I knew I would need to arm myself with constant prayer and unwavering trust in God's protection. The second footprint appeared 3 days later, this time much closer to my cabin. I found it pressed into the soft soil of my vegetable garden, right between my rows of beans and squash. The print was even clearer than the first one, and I could see details that made my hands tremble as I knelt to examine it. The toes were long and distinct, with what appeared to be nail marks at the tips. The heel was broad and deep, suggesting incredible weight. But most disturbing was the arch of the foot, which was high and well-defined, more human-like than any animal I could imagine. This was not the flat, padded foot of a bear or the cloven hoof of any woodland creature. I spent that entire evening in prayer, asking God to reveal His purpose in allowing this mystery to unfold. I opened my Bible at random, seeking guidance, and my eyes fell upon the words from Job. But ask the beasts, and they will teach you, the birds of the heavens, and they will tell you. Perhaps God was indeed teaching me something through this strange creature, whatever it might be. Then the gifts started appearing. The first one showed up 4 days after I found the footprint. I was doing my morning rounds when I noticed something hanging from a low branch near my chicken coop. It was a collection of smooth river stones threaded together with what looked like strips of bark and twisted into an intricate pattern. The craftsmanship was crude but deliberate, and it definitely hadn't been there the day before. I took it down and examined it closely. The stones were perfectly round and smooth, the kind you might find in a riverbed after years of current had worn away all the rough edges. But the nearest river was over 2 miles away, and the bark strips showed clear signs of being deliberately prepared, not just randomly torn from a tree. Who could have left this, and why? My nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and I rarely saw hikers this deep in the forest. More troubling was the question of how someone had gotten so close to my cabin without my knowledge. I'm a light sleeper, and my horse usually alerts me to any unusual presence on the property. I hung the strange ornament back where I found it, reasoning that whoever left it might return for it. But when I checked the next morning, it was gone. 2 days later, another gift appeared, this time hanging from a branch directly over my garden gate. This one was more elaborate, a collection of feathers, small bones, and what appeared to be carved pieces of wood, all woven together with the same bark strips. The feathers were from birds I recognized, crow, hawk, and what might have been eagle. But the bones looked like they came from small mammals, rabbits maybe, or squirrels. Again, the work was crude but purposeful. Someone was definitely leaving these for me to find, but I couldn't imagine who or why. The isolation that had once brought me peace was beginning to feel ominous. I began to wonder if this was similar to the trials faced by the hermit monks of old. St. Paul the Hermit wrote of strange encounters in the Egyptian desert, beings that appeared neither fully human nor animal. Could it be that in choosing this life of solitude, I had entered into a realm where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural were thinner? During my morning prayers the next day, I found myself drawn to the Psalms, particularly the verses about God's protection. He will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you will find refuge. But even as I recited these familiar words, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from the forest beyond my clearing. That afternoon, while splitting wood for my stove, I felt the distinct sensation of eyes upon me. I turned toward the tree line and saw nothing, but the feeling persisted. After finishing my work, I walked to the perimeter of my property more carefully than usual. What I found made my blood run cold. There were more footprints, forming what appeared to be a complete circle around my cabin and outbuildings. The creature had been walking around my property during the night, staying just at the edge of the forest, observing everything I had built in this small clearing. But even more disturbing were the signs that it had been there multiple times. Some of the prints were fresh, pressed into the morning dew, while others were older, partially filled with fallen leaves. This creature had been watching me for weeks, maybe months, learning my routines and habits. That night, I added extra prayers for protection and guidance. I asked God to show me the meaning of these strange events and to keep me safe from any harm that might be approaching. The third gift appeared a week later, but this time it wasn't hanging from a tree. I found it placed carefully on my front porch, right beside the door. This one was different. Instead of an ornament, it was a piece of wood about the size of a dinner plate, with symbols carved deep into its surface. The symbols didn't match any writing system I knew, and I've studied ancient languages as part of my theological education. They looked almost primitive, like something you might expect to see in prehistoric cave paintings. Some resembled animals. I could make out what might be a bear, a deer, and something that could have been a bird. Others were more abstract, consisting of geometric patterns and lines that seemed to form some kind of narrative sequence. But what disturbed me most was the carving itself. The cuts in the wood were deep and precise, made with incredible force. Whatever tool had been used, and I couldn't imagine what that might be, it had sliced through the hardwood like it was soft clay. I brought the carved wood inside and spent hours studying it by lamplight. The more I looked at it, the more convinced I became that it was trying to tell a story. The animal figures seemed to be arranged in a sequence, with the human-like shapes appearing to interact with them in various ways. One sequence particularly caught my attention. It showed what appeared to be a small structure, possibly representing my cabin, with a human figure inside. Around the structure were larger figures, much larger, that seemed to be watching or approaching. The implications made my skin crawl. That night, I barely slept. Every sound from the forest seemed amplified and threatening. The normal creaks and settling sounds of my old cabin took on sinister meanings. I found myself getting up repeatedly to check the windows and make sure the door was securely locked. During my pre-dawn prayers, I asked God for wisdom and strength. I wondered if this was some kind of test, a trial of faith similar to what the Desert Fathers experienced in their isolation. Perhaps God was allowing the devil to tempt and frighten me, testing my resolve and my trust in divine protection. I remembered reading about Saint Macarius the Great, who encountered strange and terrifying visions during his years in the Egyptian desert. He wrote that the devil would appear to him in various forms, sometimes as wild beasts, sometimes as beings that defied description. The saint's response was always the same: deeper prayer, greater trust in God, and the firm belief that no evil could ultimately harm those who belonged to Christ. Could this be my desert, my place of testing? The more I contemplated this possibility, the more it seemed to make sense. God had led me to this isolated place for a purpose, and perhaps that purpose was not just contemplation and prayer, but a trial that would purify my faith like gold refined in fire. But as the days passed and more signs appeared, I began to suspect that whatever was happening involved something more tangible than spiritual warfare. The footprints multiplied. I found them near my well, around the chicken coop, and even in my garden. Always the same enormous size, always the same almost human shape. Sometimes they appeared in sequences that suggested the creature had been walking upright, taking enormous strides that covered 8 or 9 feet between prints. Then I started finding the carvings. They appeared on trees throughout the forest around my property, always at a height that would require someone tremendously tall to reach. The marks looked like they had been made with claws or fingernails, gouged deep into the bark in patterns that seemed both random and purposeful. Some of the markings were clearly territorial, long parallel scratches that scarred the bark from 7 feet off the ground down to about 4 feet. Others were more complex, resembling the symbols I had seen on the wooden plaque left on my porch. The height of these markings troubled me greatly. No human could reach 7 feet up on a tree trunk without a ladder, and I had seen no evidence of tools or equipment anywhere on my property. What kind of creature could casually reach such heights while walking through the forest? I began to find other disturbing signs during my daily walks. Trees that had been pushed over, not cut or broken by wind, but actually uprooted by tremendous force. Boulders that had been moved from their original positions, some weighing hundreds of pounds, repositioned as if they were pebbles. Most unsettling of all were the structures I began to discover deeper in the forest. They appeared to be shelters of some kind, constructed from large branches and logs arranged in rough lean-to formations. The construction was primitive but deliberate, and the size of the structures suggested they were built for something much larger than any human. One afternoon, while following a deer trail about a quarter mile from my cabin, I came upon a clearing I had never seen before. In the center of this clearing was what I can only describe as an altar of sorts. Large stones had been arranged in a rough circle, and in the center was a collection of animal bones, feathers, and carved pieces of wood similar to the gifts that had been left on my property. The arrangement was clearly ceremonial, but it was unlike any religious practice I knew. The bones appeared to be from various forest animals, deer, rabbits, birds, and they had been cleaned and arranged with obvious care. Some of the carved wood pieces bore symbols that seemed to tell stories, though I couldn't decipher their meaning. As I stood in that clearing, examining this primitive shrine, I felt a profound sense of being observed. The forest around me seemed to pulse with hidden life, as if dozens of eyes were watching my every movement. I whispered a prayer for protection and quickly made my way back to my cabin. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled upon something sacred to whatever creature was sharing this forest with me. That evening, during my prayers, I found myself wondering about the nature of this being. If it was capable of constructing altars and creating symbolic art, then it possessed intelligence far beyond that of any known animal. But if it was intelligent, what did it want with me? And why had it chosen to reveal itself now, after I had lived peacefully in this place for so long? The pattern was always the same. The creature, and I was becoming more convinced that's what I was dealing with, would leave its gifts or markings, then retreat back into the deep forest. But each incident brought it a little closer to my cabin, and the signs of its presence were becoming bolder and more frequent. 3 weeks into this strange ordeal, I finally saw it. I was chopping wood behind my cabin in the late afternoon when movement in the forest caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving the branches, but then I realized the movement was too organized, too purposeful. There, standing between two massive pine trees about 100 yards away, was something that defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It stood upright like a man, but it was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. Its body was covered in dark hair or fur, and its shoulders were incredibly broad, much wider than any human could possibly be. Even at that distance, I could see the muscle definition beneath the hair, and the way it held itself suggested immense strength. But it was the face that truly shook me. Even from 100 yards away, I could see that it was neither fully human nor fully animal. The features were heavy and primitive, with a pronounced brow ridge and a jaw that seemed too large for the face. But there was intelligence in its posture, in the way it held its head, in the deliberate way it positioned itself so that I could see it clearly. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Though it was probably only 30 or 40 seconds, the creature didn't move, didn't make any threatening gestures. It simply watched me as if studying my reaction. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and melted back into the forest. I heard the sound of heavy footsteps moving away, snapping branches and disturbing undergrowth. But within moments, even those sounds faded into the normal quiet of the woods. I stood there holding my axe, my heart pounding and my hands trembling. What I had just seen challenged everything I thought I understood about the world. This wasn't a bear or any other known animal. It wasn't a person in costume. No human could be that size or move with that kind of fluid power through dense forest. But more than the physical impossibility of what I had witnessed, I was struck by the creature's behavior. It had deliberately positioned itself where I could see it clearly. It had waited for me to notice it, then allowed me to observe it for an extended period. This wasn't the behavior of a wild animal which would either attack or flee when confronted by a human. This was the behavior of an intelligent being that was trying to communicate something. As I stood there in the fading afternoon light, clutching my axe and struggling to process what I had seen, I found myself thinking of the words from Ecclesiastes. For God may speak in one way or in another, yet man does not perceive it. Could it be that the Almighty was trying to teach me something through this encounter? Was this creature, impossible as it seemed, part of God's creation that had remained hidden from the modern world? I remembered the words of St. John Chrysostom, who wrote that God's creation contains mysteries that human understanding cannot fully grasp. Perhaps I was being granted a glimpse into one of these mysteries, a reminder of how vast and incomprehensible the Creator's works truly are. That night, I spent hours in prayer, trying to make sense of what I'd witnessed. Was this creature one of God's creations that had somehow remained hidden from the modern world? Was it something else entirely, something that existed outside the natural order? The more I prayed and reflected, the more I became convinced that this was indeed a test of faith. God was presenting me with something beyond normal human experience, challenging me to maintain my trust in divine providence despite facing the unknown and frightening. I thought of Job, who was tested by encounters with creatures beyond his understanding, and who ultimately learned that God's ways are far beyond human comprehension. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? God had asked Job. Perhaps I was being asked the same question, being shown how little I truly understood about the world God had created. But if this was a test, it was about to become much more intense. The next morning brought the first real sign of aggression. I woke to find that something had been at my chicken coop during the night. The wire mesh had been torn apart like tissue paper, bent and twisted with tremendous force. 3 of my hens were missing, and the ground around the coop was churned up with those enormous footprints. But the most unsettling discovery was what had been left behind. Scattered around the damaged coop were more of those carved symbols, this time scratched directly into the ground. The marks were deep and fresh, made sometime in the dark hours before dawn. I spent the morning repairing the coop as best I could and moving my remaining chickens to a more secure area closer to the house. But I knew that if this creature wanted to take my animals, no fence or enclosure I could build would stop it. That afternoon brought another sighting, this one much closer to the house. I was working in my garden when I heard a sound that made every hair on my body stand up. It was a call or vocalization unlike anything I had ever heard. Deep, resonant, and somehow both animal and human at the same time. It seemed to come from directly behind my cabin, no more than 50 yards away. I dropped my tools and crept around the side of the building, moving as quietly as possible. What I saw when I peered around the corner nearly stopped my heart. The creature was standing at the edge of my property, but this time it wasn't trying to hide. It was in full view, and in the bright afternoon sunlight, I could see details that had been hidden during our first encounter. Its hair was dark brown, almost black, and covered its entire body except for the face, palms, and soles of its feet. The hair was coarse and thick, more like an animal's coat than human hair. Its arms were incredibly long, reaching almost to its knees, and its hands were enormous, with fingers that looked powerful enough to crush stone. But again, it was the face that commanded attention. The features were undeniably primitive, but there was an intelligence behind the small, dark eyes that was unmistakable. This was no mindless beast. It was thinking, evaluating, making decisions. As I watched, the creature bent down and picked up something from the ground, another of those carved wooden plaques. It held it up where I could clearly see it, then placed it deliberately on a tree stump at the very edge of my property. The message was clear. It knew I was watching, and it wanted me to find what it had left. After the creature disappeared back into the forest, I approached the stump with considerable caution. The wooden plaque was similar to the others, but the symbols carved into it were more complex and seemed to tell a more detailed story. This time I could make out what appeared to be a sequence showing multiple large figures approaching a small structure. The human figure inside the structure seemed to be in various poses, some suggesting prayer or supplication, others showing what might be fear or hiding. But the final image in the sequence was what truly disturbed me. It showed the small structure surrounded by the large figures, with what appeared to be smaller figures, possibly representing my animals, scattered around the outside. As I studied these carvings in the fading daylight, I was struck by their sophistication. While the execution was primitive, the storytelling was complex and deliberate. This creature was not only intelligent, but was trying to communicate with me through these symbolic narratives. I carried the plaque back to my cabin and spent much of that evening studying it by lamplight, trying to decipher its meaning. The more I examined it, the more I became convinced that it was a warning, or perhaps a prophecy of what was to come. In my prayers that night, I asked God for wisdom to understand what was being revealed to me. I found myself drawn to the book of Daniel, where the prophet interpreted mysterious writings and visions. Perhaps, like Daniel, I was being called to understand communications that came from beyond normal human experience. But even as I prayed for understanding, I felt a growing sense of urgency. The creature's behavior was becoming more bold and direct. What had started as distant observations had progressed to deliberate communication. I sensed that whatever was going to happen would happen soon. The next morning brought confirmation of my fears. I woke to find that something had been at my well during the night. The wooden cover had been removed and set aside, and the rope I used to draw water had been pulled up and examined. Large, wet handprints on the wooden planks around the well showed where the creature had knelt to drink. But more disturbing than the evidence of the creature's presence was what I found next to the well. Arranged in a neat line were 5 smooth stones, each about the size of my fist, positioned pointing directly toward my cabin. The message seemed clear. The creature was counting down to something. Over the next 3 days, I found similar arrangements of stones appearing around my property. 4 stones near my garden gate, 3 stones by the path to my chicken coop, 2 stones on my front porch. On the morning I found a single stone placed directly in front of my door, I knew my time of preparation was over. I clutched my cross and whispered a prayer. Whatever this creature was planning, it seemed to involve my livestock and possibly much more. That night, I made a decision that would prove to be crucial for my survival. I brought all my animals closer to the house and reinforced every possible entry point to my cabin. I nailed boards over the windows, barricaded the door, and brought my horse into a small enclosure I hastily constructed right next to the house. My chickens and goats went into a reinforced pen that I positioned where I could see it from my main window. If something was going to happen, I wanted to be ready. I spent the evening in intensive prayer, asking God for protection and guidance. I prayed for understanding of why this trial was being placed before me, and for the strength to face whatever was coming with faith intact. As darkness fell, the forest around my cabin became unnaturally quiet. No night birds called, no small mammals rustled through the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to have died away, leaving an oppressive silence that pressed against my windows like a living thing. Around midnight, the sounds began. At first, it was just the snap of branches somewhere in the darkness beyond my property line, but the sounds were moving, circling my cabin at a consistent distance of maybe 200 yards. Whatever was out there, it was large enough to break substantial tree limbs without slowing down, and it was moving with purpose. I knelt by my window, clutching my prayer rope and whispering continuous prayers for protection. The sounds continued for over an hour, slowly getting closer to the house. By 1 a.m, whatever was out there had closed the distance to less than 100 yards. That's when I heard the first growl. It was low and rumbling, so deep that I felt it in my chest as much as I heard it. It didn't sound like any animal I knew, not a bear, not a big cat, nothing that should exist in these forests. But there was intelligence behind it, a deliberate quality that suggested communication rather than just animal vocalization. The growl was answered from another direction, then another and another. My blood ran cold as I realized what was happening. There wasn't just one creature out there. There were several, and they were coordinating their movements around my property. I pressed my face to the gap between two boards I had nailed over my window, trying to see into the darkness. For several long minutes, I saw nothing but the familiar shapes of trees and shadows. Then something moved. A shape detached itself from the tree line and began moving across my property toward the house. Even in the darkness, I could see it was enormous and walking upright. As it got closer, another shape emerged from a different direction, then another. They were approaching from multiple sides, moving with deliberate coordination. This wasn't the random behavior of wild animals. This was planned. When the first creature reached the edge of my garden, maybe 30 yards from the house, it stopped and made that deep, rumbling call again. The others responded immediately, and I watched in terror as they began to close in on my cabin. The sound that came next was unlike anything I had experienced in my 4 years of isolated living. It was a pounding on my door that shook the entire cabin, accompanied by a roar that seemed to come from the very depths of hell. Boom, boom, boom. Each impact sent vibrations through the floor and walls. My barricaded door held, but I could hear the wood beginning to strain under the tremendous force. I dropped to my knees and began praying aloud, calling on God to protect me from whatever demonic forces had been unleashed against me. But even as I prayed, another sound joined the assault on my door, the same pounding coming from the side of the cabin as if another creature was trying to find a different way in. Then came the most terrifying moment of the entire ordeal. As I knelt there praying, I heard a soft scratching sound near the window where I had been watching. I looked up to see that one of the boards I had nailed over the window was being slowly pried away from the outside. Within moments, a gap had opened between the boards and something was peering through into my cabin. It was an eye, an enormous, dark eye that seemed to glow with reflected light from my oil lamp. The eye was easily twice the size of a human eye. Set in what I could see was a massive, hair-covered face. The eye blinked, and I could see intelligence behind it, a consciousness that was studying me as intensely as I was staring at it. We were less than 3 feet apart, separated only by a few inches of wood and that narrow gap. I fell forward onto my hands and began praying with desperate intensity, begging God to deliver me from this trial. The pounding on the door continued, the cabin shook with each impact, and I could hear more sounds of the creatures trying to find ways into the house. Then suddenly, everything changed. From my small animal enclosure next to the house came a sound that I will never forget. My horse, a gentle mare I had owned for 3 years, let out a scream that was barely recognizable as coming from a horse. It was a sound of pure terror and agony, high-pitched and desperate, unlike anything I'd ever heard from any animal. The effect on the creatures outside was immediate and dramatic. The pounding on my door stopped. The scratching at my window ceased. Even the low growling fell silent. But the silence was broken by new sounds, the sounds of my horse continuing to scream and of something large moving toward the animal enclosure. I remained on my knees, praying continuously through the long night. I could hear sounds from outside, growling, the breaking of wood, and occasionally more screams from my animals. But I didn't dare look. I kept my eyes closed and my prayers constant, trusting that God would see me through until morning. As the hours passed, the sounds gradually diminished. The growling became less frequent, then stopped entirely. The breaking and crashing sounds faded away. by the time the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the gaps in my boarded windows, the forest had returned to its normal quiet. I waited until the sun was fully up before I dared to remove the barricades from my door. My hands were shaking as I pulled away the boards and furniture I had piled against it, and I said a prayer before turning the handle. The morning sunlight revealed devastation that exceeded my worst fears. My garden had been completely destroyed. Plants were trampled and torn up by the roots, and the ground was churned up with those enormous footprints. The fence around my property had been torn apart in several places, with sections of wire mesh twisted into unrecognizable shapes. But the real horror waited at my animal enclosures. The small pen where I'd kept my chickens and goats was obliterated. The wooden posts had been snapped off at ground level, and the wire mesh had been shredded like paper. Scattered around the area were feathers and tufts of goat hair, along with dark stains on the ground that I didn't want to examine too closely. I could account for only 2 of my chickens, and one of my goats was missing entirely. The other goat was there, but it had clearly been attacked. It was still alive, but barely, and I knew I would need to put it out of its misery. The horse enclosure next to the house showed signs of incredible violence. The wooden rails had been smashed to pieces, and the small shelter I had built was completely destroyed. But there was no sign of my horse anywhere. I walked in an expanding circle around the property, looking for any trace of my missing animals. What I found was a trail of disturbed ground and broken vegetation leading into the forest. The trail was marked with those enormous footprints and drag marks that suggested something large and heavy had been pulled along the ground. I followed the trail for about 50 yards before I found what remained of my horse. I won't describe what I saw there, except to say that it was clear the animal had been killed quickly, then partially consumed. But perhaps most disturbing was the evidence that much of the horse had been carried away, presumably as food for the creatures that had attacked my property. As I stood there in that small clearing, looking at the remains of my faithful horse, I was overcome with a profound realization. The sounds my horse had made during the night, those terrible screams of terror and pain, had saved my life. When the horse cried out, it had drawn the attention of the creatures away from my cabin and toward the animal enclosure. Instead of continuing their assault on my door and windows, they had abandoned their attack on me in favor of easier prey. God had answered my prayers, but not in the way I had expected. Rather than driving away the creatures or making me invisible to them, He had provided an alternative that would satisfy their hunger and aggression. My animals had died so that I could live. As I knelt there beside the torn remains of my faithful mare, I was reminded of the words of Christ. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. My horse had done exactly that, sacrificing herself to save my life. In her terror and pain, she had called out, and her cries had redirected the creature's attention away from me. I thought of Abraham, who was prepared to sacrifice his son Isaac in obedience to God, only to have the Lord provide a ram caught in the thicket as a substitute offering. In the same way, God had provided my animals as a substitute for me, sparing my life through their sacrifice. But this realization brought with it a profound sense of responsibility. If God had chosen to spare me through the sacrifice of these innocent creatures, then there must be a purpose for my continued existence. I had been given a second chance at life, purchased with the blood of my animals, and I could not waste this gift. I spent several minutes in silent prayer, asking God to help me understand the full meaning of what had transpired. Why had He allowed these creatures to exist? Why had He permitted them to threaten me only to provide deliverance through sacrifice? What was I supposed to learn from this terrifying experience? As I prayed, I found myself thinking about the nature of the creatures themselves. They had shown intelligence, coordination, and even a form of communication through their symbolic gifts. They had demonstrated planning and patience, studying me for weeks before making their move. These were not mindless beasts driven by simple hunger. Could it be that they too were part of God's creation, creatures that had remained hidden in the deep places of the earth while human civilization spread across the land? Perhaps they were remnants of an earlier time, beings that God had preserved for his own purposes, unknown and incomprehensible to human understanding. I knelt beside the remains of my horse and said a prayer of gratitude for her sacrifice and for all the animals that had given their lives to save mine. I also prayed for forgiveness as I realized that my decision to isolate myself in this remote location had ultimately put my animals in harm's way. But along with my grief and guilt, I felt something else, a deeper understanding of divine providence and the mysterious ways in which God works to protect those who trust in him. I gathered the few belongings I could carry, my Bible, some food, and my spare clothing, and prepared to leave the cabin that had been my home for 4 years. It was clear that I could no longer live safely in this location, and I had no desire to remain where such violence had occurred. Before leaving, I conducted a final service for my dead animals, thanking them for their sacrifice and committing their souls to God's mercy. I also said a prayer for the creatures that had attacked my property, asking God to provide for their needs in ways that didn't require them to threaten human settlements. As I locked the door of my cabin for the last time, I clutched the cross that hung around my neck and began the long walk through the forest toward the nearest town. The journey took almost a full day, following old logging roads and game trails through the dense woodland. My legs were unsteady from the terror of the previous night, and I had to rest frequently. But I maintained continuous prayer throughout the walk, thanking God for my deliverance and asking for guidance about what I should do next. Several times during the journey, I thought I heard sounds following me through the forest, the snap of branches and the soft thud of heavy footsteps. But whenever I stopped to listen, the sound stopped too, and I never saw any sign of the creatures that had destroyed my property. By late afternoon, I was dehydrated and exhausted, but I could see the first buildings of the small mountain town ahead of me. As I emerged from the forest onto the main road, I fell to my knees and offered a final prayer of thanksgiving for my safe delivery. The people in town took me in and listened to my story with a mixture of concern and skepticism. Most seemed to think I had encountered an unusually aggressive bear, and they advised me to report the incident to the wildlife authorities. But I knew what I had seen, I knew what had stalked me for weeks, what had coordinated an attack on my property, and what had demonstrated intelligence and planning far beyond any known animal. I also knew that my faith had been tested in ways I never could have imagined, and that I had emerged from that test with a deeper understanding of God's providence and protection. As I write this account, several weeks later, I'm living in a small apartment in town and serving as an assistant to the local parish priest. I've decided not to return to the isolated life I once cherished. Instead, I'm focusing on serving God within a community where I can share the lessons I learned during those terrifying weeks in the forest. I still don't fully understand what those creatures were or why they focused their attention on me. But I'm certain that my encounter with them was part of God's plan for my life, a trial that was meant to deepen my faith and teach me about divine protection in the face of the unknown. Every night before I sleep, I pray for the souls of my animals that died protecting me. And I thank God for using their sacrifice to deliver me from evil. And sometimes, when I'm walking alone on the quiet streets of this small town, I remember the feeling of that enormous eye watching me through the gap in my window. And I'm grateful beyond words to be alive to tell this story. The mysteries of God's creation are vast and sometimes terrifying, but His love and protection are even greater. That's the lesson I learned in those dark woods, and it's a lesson I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. October 18, 1985, 32-year-old experienced hiker Jack Morrison set out alone on a 5-day section hike of the Appalachian Trail through Great Smoky Mountains National Park along the Tennessee-North Carolina border. 1 week later, he vanished without a trace. On October 28th, a search and rescue team discovered a destroyed campsite believed to belong to Jack, along with his torn backpack, scattered gear, and a camera containing photographs that would change everything. Jack's body was never recovered, but the evidence left behind painted a terrifying picture of his final days, stalked, hunted, and ultimately consumed by something that should not exist. Jack Morrison was no ordinary weekend warrior. A seasoned outdoorsman from Richmond, Virginia, Jack had spent over 15 years exploring America's most challenging wilderness areas. He was a certified wilderness survival instructor who had completed solo hikes on the Continental Divide Trail, sections of the Pacific Crest Trail, and multiple Appalachian Trail segments. Friends described him as methodical, prepared, and someone who could survive in the backcountry longer than almost anyone they knew. He carried military-grade equipment, knew how to find water and shelter in any conditions, and had successfully navigated through severe weather that would turn back most experienced hikers. His planned route for October 1985 was a familiar one, a 47-mile section from Newfound Gap to Fontana Dam, passing through some of the most remote and pristine wilderness in the eastern United States. The Great Smoky Mountains section of the Appalachian Trail winds through dense, old-growth forests, crosses numerous ridgelines above 5,000 feet, and includes stretches where hikers can go days without seeing another person. For someone with Jack's experience, it should have been a routine trek through one of his favorite sections of trail. What Jack didn't know was that he was walking into a wilderness that harbored something far more dangerous than black bears or sudden weather changes. My name doesn't matter. What matters is what I witnessed during my 3 years as a backcountry ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park from 1983 to 1986. I was responsible for monitoring the remote sections of the Appalachian Trail, maintaining shelters, and conducting search and rescue operations when hikers went missing. In those days, we saw our share of accidents, injuries, and the occasional fatality from exposure or falls. But nothing prepared me for what happened to Jack Morrison or for the cover-up that followed. During 1984 and the first half of 1985, we began receiving unusual reports from hikers traversing the more isolated sections of the AT through the Smokies. These weren't your typical bear encounter stories or complaints about rowdy campers. Experienced hikers, people who knew the difference between a black bear and a wild boar, were reporting massive bipedal tracks found near their campsites. Some described hearing vocalizations at night that didn't match any known wildlife in the region. Deep, guttural howls that seemed almost human but far too large and powerful to come from a person. Several hikers reported the unsettling sensation of being watched or followed, particularly in the stretch between Icewater Springs Shelter and Derrick Knob Shelter. They described finding their food caches disturbed in ways that didn't fit typical bear behavior, containers not just open but twisted and crushed with what appeared to be tremendous strength. Most disturbing were the deer carcasses we occasionally found hung high in trees, sometimes 15 or 20 feet off the ground, in positions that no known predator in the region could achieve. Park management attributed these incidents to an unusually large black bear population recovering after years of protection, or to the rare but documented presence of wild boar in the area. The official policy was to downplay anything that might suggest the presence of an unknown predator. Bad for tourism, bad for the park's reputation. We were instructed to log such reports as bear activity and move on. But those of us working the backcountry knew something else was out there. Jack registered for his hike at the Sugarlands Visitor Center on October 17, 1985. I was working the information desk that day and spoke with him briefly about trail conditions and weather forecasts. He was planning a standard 5-day trek with 4 nights in the backcountry, carrying a full winter kit, despite the relatively mild October temperatures. When I asked about his experience level, he showed me a worn AT guidebook filled with notes and maps from previous hikes. This was clearly someone who knew what he was doing. The weather forecast called for mild days in the 60s and cool nights in the 40s, with a chance of rain on the 3rd and 4th days. Perfect autumn hiking weather. Jack planned to camp at designated sites, first night at Icewater Springs Shelter, second night at Mount Collins Shelter, third night at Derrick Knob Shelter, and fourth night near Molly's Ridge before finishing at Fontana Dam on October 22nd. I had radio contact with Jack on his first evening when he checked in from Icewater Springs Shelter as required. He reported normal conditions, good weather, and no problems. His voice was relaxed and cheerful. Exactly what you'd expect from an experienced hiker enjoying a solo trip in one of America's most beautiful wilderness areas. That was the last time anyone heard from Jack Morrison alive. When Jack failed to arrive at Fontana Dam for his scheduled pickup on October 22nd, his emergency contact, his brother Michael, waited until the following morning before notifying park authorities. It wasn't unusual for hikers to run a day behind schedule due to weather or trail conditions, but Jack was known for his punctuality and had never missed a pickup time in 15 years of solo hiking. Search and rescue operations began on October 24th. I was part of the initial team that retraced Jack's planned route, starting from his last known position at Icewater Springs Shelter. We found evidence that he had indeed spent his first night there. The shelter log showed his signature, dated October 18th, along with a brief note. Great weather, perfect hiking, saw largest bear tracks I've ever encountered near the spring. Strange smell in the area, like rotting meat mixed with wet dog. Otherwise, excellent start to the trip. At Mount Collins Shelter, we found no evidence that Jack had stayed there on his second night. The shelter log had no entry from him, and there were no signs of his camp in the designated camping areas. This was unusual, but not alarming. Experienced hikers sometimes altered their planned itinerary based on conditions or personal preference. The trail between Mount Collins and Derrick Knob Shelter covers some of the most remote terrain in the entire park. It's a challenging 8.7-mile stretch that includes several steep climbs and descents with limited visibility due to dense forest cover. On October 25th, our search team made a discovery that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Approximately 2 miles before Derrick Knob Shelter, about 200 yards off the main trail near a small stream, we found what remained of Jack's third campsite. I've investigated dozens of bear attacks, weather-related accidents, and other wilderness incidents during my career, but nothing prepared me for what we discovered that day. Jack's tent, a high-quality 4-season model designed to withstand severe weather, had been completely destroyed. But this wasn't the methodical destruction you see from bears investigating food sources. The tent appeared to have been torn apart with incredible violence and precision. The fabric wasn't just ripped, it was shredded in long, parallel gashes that suggested claws far larger than any black bear possesses. The aluminum tent poles were not just bent, but twisted into spirals, as if something with tremendous strength had simply wrung them like wet towels. Jack's backpack lay in pieces scattered across a 50-yard radius. His sleeping bag had been torn into strips and was hanging from tree branches 12 feet off the ground. Food containers made of hard plastic were crushed flat and showed what appeared to be bite marks, punctures that would have required jaw strength far exceeding that of any known animal in the region. Most disturbing was the complete absence of Jack himself. Despite the violence evident at the campsite, there was no blood on the ground, no torn clothing, no signs of a struggle. It was as if he had simply vanished while whatever destroyed his camp methodically demolished everything he owned. The forest around the campsite told a different story. Trees showed fresh gouges in the bark, some extending 10 feet up the trunk, far higher than any bear could reach. The ground was disturbed in a pattern that suggested something very large had circled the campsite multiple times before the attack. Most unsettling were the tracks we found in the soft earth near the stream. They were unlike anything in my training or experience. Each print measured approximately 17 inches long and 7 inches wide, with 5 distinct toe impressions and what appeared to be claw marks extending beyond each toe. The stride length between prints was nearly 4 feet, far longer than a human's gait, and unlike the four-legged pattern you'd expect from a bear. Whatever made these tracks walked upright on 2 legs and stood at least 8 feet tall, following a trail of broken branches and disturbed vegetation leading uphill from the destroyed campsite. We found Jack's camera hanging from a tree branch about 300 yards away. The camera itself was undamaged, but the strap had been deliberately placed over the branch, not caught or snagged, but positioned as if someone wanted it to be found. When we developed the film, we discovered that Jack had been photographing his stalker for at least 2 days before the attack. The first unusual photograph was taken on the morning of October 19th, his second day on the trail. It showed a distant view of the trail ahead, with what appeared to be a large, dark figure partially obscured by trees approximately 100 yards in front of him. At first glance, it looked like another hiker, but closer examination revealed proportions that were distinctly non-human. The figure stood nearly 8 feet tall and appeared to be covered in dark, shaggy hair. What made this first photograph particularly disturbing was the posture of the figure. It wasn't walking along the trail like a normal hiker would. Instead, it appeared to be crouched behind a large oak tree, partially concealed, as if deliberately hiding while observing Jack's approach. The creature's head was turned toward the camera, and even at that distance, there was something unsettling about the way it held itself. Too still, too focused, like a predator studying its prey. Subsequent photos taken throughout October 19th and 20th showed the same figure at various distances. In some images, it appeared to be following the trail ahead of Jack. In others, it was visible moving through the forest parallel to his route. The most chilling sequence was captured on the evening of October 19th, just before sunset. Jack had apparently set up his camera on a tripod to photograph the mountain vista, but the images instead documented something far more sinister. In the photo, a massive dark shape was visible approximately 200 yards down the trail. By the third photograph, the figure had moved significantly closer, perhaps 150 yards, and was clearly visible as the same creature from the earlier images. This sequence proved that Jack was being actively stalked. The creature was following his exact route, staying far enough behind to avoid direct confrontation, but close enough to monitor his movements. The methodical nature of this pursuit suggested intelligence far beyond that of any known animal in the region. One particularly clear photograph, taken on the evening of October 20th, showed the creature standing in a clearing approximately 50 yards away, staring directly at the camera. Its face was partially human but distorted, heavy brow ridge, enlarged jaw, eyes that reflected light like an animal's. What struck me most about this image was the creature's expression. It wasn't the blank stare you'd expect from an animal accidentally photographed. Instead, there was something calculating in its gaze, as if it was aware of being photographed and was deliberately allowing itself to be documented. The creature's physical characteristics were clearly visible in this photograph. Its shoulders were massively broad, far wider than any humans could be. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in hands that appeared disproportionately large, even for its substantial frame. The face, while showing humanoid features, was distinctly primitive. Heavy brow ridge, receding forehead, and a jaw that protruded forward in a way that suggested powerful bite force. The penultimate photograph showed the creature much closer to Jack's campsite, perhaps only 30 yards away, partially concealed behind a cluster of rhododendron bushes. The image quality was sharp enough to show individual hairs in its coat and the reflection of Jack's campfire in its eyes. What made this photograph particularly unnerving was the timestamp, 11:47 p.m. on October 20th. Jack had been photographing his stalker in near darkness, probably using a flash, which meant the creature had been bold enough to approach his camp while he was still awake and active. The final photograph was taken on the morning of October 21st, the day of the attack. It showed massive tracks in the mud beside Jack's tent, with what appeared to be the creature's hand, easily twice the size of a human hand, pressed into the soft earth beside his campsite. But this wasn't just a random handprint. The fingers were spread wide and pressed deep into the mud, as if the creature had been steadying itself while examining Jack's tent. The implications were terrifying. The creature had been close enough to touch Jack's shelter while he slept inside. Analysis of the photographs revealed another disturbing detail. In several images, particularly those taken on October 20th, there appeared to be more than one figure in the background. While the primary creature was clearly visible, careful examination showed what might have been additional shapes moving through the forest behind it. If accurate, this suggested that Jack hadn't been stalked by a lone predator, but by a group of these creatures working together. Jack had been aware he was being stalked and had documented his stalker with the methodical precision of an experienced outdoorsman. The progression of photographs told a clear story. Something had been following him for at least 3 days, gradually moving closer, studying his habits and behavior, until it finally made its move on his 4th night in the wilderness. The final images suggested that Jack had known his situation was desperate, but had continued documenting what he encountered right up until the end. Hidden in a waterproof pouch inside Jack's scattered gear, we discovered his trail journal. The entries provided a chilling first-person account of his final days and confirmed what the photographs had suggested. Jack had been aware he was being hunted. The early entries were typical of his previous hiking journals, notes about trail conditions, weather observations, and his usual detailed recordings of wildlife sightings. But beginning on October 19th, the tone changed dramatically. October 19th. Morning. Something's not right. Found huge tracks near my campsite this morning, definitely not bear. Bipedal, human-like, but way too big, at least 17 inches long. I've been hiking these mountains for 15 years and never seen anything like them. The tracks circled my tent multiple times during the night. Whatever made them was studying my camp while I slept. October 21st, final entry. It's almost dark and I can hear them out there. Them, plural. There's more than one now. They're communicating with each other, making sounds like nothing I've ever heard. Deep howls that seem almost like language. They're coordinating something. I think tonight they're going to make their move. I've got my knife ready, but I know it won't be enough. If someone finds this journal, know that I documented everything I could. The photos are in my camera. This thing is real and it's been hunting in these mountains. People need to know. The journal entries provided crucial context for the photographs and confirmed the timeline of events. Jack had been aware of the danger he was in, but had chosen to continue documenting his experience rather than abandoning his equipment and attempting to flee through unfamiliar terrain in darkness. His final entry suggested that multiple creatures had been involved in the attack, which explained the efficiency with which his campsite had been destroyed and his body removed without leaving any trace. Beyond the photographs and journal, our search team discovered other evidence that painted a disturbing picture of what Jack had encountered. Scattered throughout the area within a quarter-mile radius of his destroyed campsite, we found signs of significant non-human activity that had been ongoing for some time. Trees showed fresh gouges in the bark at heights ranging from 6 to 12 feet off the ground, far higher than any known animal in the region could reach. The marks weren't random scratches, but appeared deliberate, almost like territorial markings. Some trees showed repeated scarring over what appeared to be multiple seasons, suggesting this area had been regularly visited by the creatures over an extended period. We discovered several crude structures deep in the forest that defied easy explanation. Arranged in a rough circle about half a mile from Jack's campsite were 5 constructions made from broken branches and logs. Each stood approximately 8 feet tall and was built in a teepee-like configuration, but with a sophistication that suggested intentional design rather than random natural formation. The branches had been deliberately broken and woven together in patterns that would have required considerable intelligence and manual dexterity to create. Inside one of these structures, we found what appeared to be a cache of bones, mostly from deer and smaller mammals, but the arrangement was distinctly unnatural. Most disturbing was the discovery of partially buried human artifacts scattered throughout the area. We found fragments of clothing, pieces of camping equipment, and personal items that appeared to have come from multiple different sources. A torn piece of fabric that looked like it came from a hiking boot, a crushed water bottle of a brand that had been discontinued several years earlier, and most unsettling, a driver's license from 1982 belonging to a hiker who had been reported missing from the same general area 3 years before Jack's disappearance. These artifacts suggested that Jack wasn't the first victim, and that whatever had killed him had been hunting humans in this area for an extended period. The creatures appeared to be collecting trophies or souvenirs from their victims, behavior that indicated not just intelligence but a level of psychological sophistication that was deeply unsettling. When our search team returned to park headquarters with the camera and our findings from the destroyed campsite, the response was immediate and decisive. The photographs were confiscated by the park superintendent within hours. A meeting was called with all personnel involved in the search, and we were informed that Jack Morrison had been the victim of a fatal bear attack. The official report stated that Jack had improperly stored food in his tent, attracting a large black bear that attacked during the night. His body had been dragged away by the bear and was presumed to be in an inaccessible location, which explained why remains had not been recovered. The unusual evidence found at the campsite, the height of the claw marks, the twisted tent poles, the size of the tracks, was omitted entirely from the official documentation. We were instructed that any discussion of the case outside official channels would result in immediate termination and possible legal action. The photographs, we were told, were being sent to wildlife experts for analysis and would not be made available to the public or Jack's family. When pressed about the clearly non-human proportions visible in several images, we were told that atmospheric distortion and camera angle can create misleading perspectives. I knew what I had seen both in those photographs and at that campsite. This was no bear attack. Something else, something that should not exist according to conventional zoology, had stalked Jack Morrison for days before killing him in a violent confrontation that left no trace of his body. Returning to park records, I began a systematic review of missing person cases in the Great Smoky Mountains area over the previous 5 years. What I found was a pattern that had been hidden by bureaucratic compartmentalization and the tendency to classify unexplained disappearances as accidents or getting lost. Between 1980 and 1985, 17 hikers had gone missing in the park under circumstances that shared disturbing similarities with Jack Morrison's disappearance. All were experienced solo hikers. All had vanished in the same general area of the Appalachian Trail between Newfound Gap and Fontana Dam. In each case, either no remains were found, or only partial remains were recovered in locations far from the hikers' planned route. The official explanations varied: falls from cliffs, though no bodies were found at the bottom; bear attacks, though no bear sign was discovered; getting lost and succumbing to exposure, though all were experienced hikers familiar with the area; and equipment failure, though detailed investigations were never conducted. Most telling was the seasonal pattern: disappearances clustered in late fall and early winter, typically October through December, when hiking traffic was lighter and victims were more likely to be traveling alone. This suggested a predator that had learned to associate that time of year with isolated, vulnerable prey. I began to understand that Jack Morrison hadn't been the victim of a random encounter. He had walked into the territory of something that had been systematically hunting humans in that area for years. The Park Service knew, or at least suspected, but had chosen to cover up the truth rather than risk the panic and economic impact that would result from acknowledging the presence of an unknown predator. The discovery I made in the feeding area 3 weeks after Jack's disappearance was far more extensive and horrifying than I initially described. What I found wasn't just a collection of bones, it was evidence of systematic predation that had been going on for years, possibly decades. The clearing was roughly circular, about 50 feet in diameter, and appeared to have been deliberately maintained. Smaller trees and undergrowth had been cleared away, creating an open space that was invisible from any hiking trail but easily accessible to something large moving through the forest. The ground was packed hard from repeated use, and there were clear paths leading into the clearing from multiple directions. Scattered throughout the clearing were personal artifacts from the victims. I found fragments of hiking boots, pieces of backpack frames, crushed camping equipment, and dozens of smaller personal items. Watches, jewelry, wallets, even eyeglasses. These items appeared to have been collected deliberately rather than simply left behind by accident. Some were arranged in small piles as if they were being sorted or organized according to some criteria that made sense to the creatures. The feeding ground showed clear evidence of regular use extending back several years. Tree branches at the edge of the clearing showed worn areas where something large had repeatedly brushed against them. A small stream that ran along one side of the clearing had been partially diverted to create a shallow pool, suggesting the creatures had modified their environment for convenience. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of what appeared to be newer construction within the clearing. Several wooden posts had been driven into the ground in a precise geometric pattern, and bones had been arranged around them in ways that suggested symbolic or ritualistic significance. This wasn't just a feeding area, it was a shrine or temple where the creatures gathered to consume their prey according to some cultural tradition that spoke to intelligence far beyond what we had imagined. The Williams investigation. The disappearance of Marcus Williams in October 1986 represented a turning point in both the creature's behavior and the Park Service's response to the ongoing crisis. Williams was not just another experienced hiker, he was a professional wilderness guide with extensive knowledge of the Great Smoky Mountains and a reputation for being extremely cautious and well-prepared. Williams had been hired by a nature magazine to document autumn wildlife behavior in the park's most remote areas. His assignment specifically included the section of the Appalachian Trail where Jack Morrison had vanished, though he had not been informed of the previous incidents. The magazine editors later told investigators that they had chosen Williams specifically because of his reputation for getting into areas where other photographers couldn't or wouldn't go. Williams was carrying significantly more sophisticated equipment than previous victims. In addition to professional camera gear, he had motion-activated wildlife cameras, infrared photography equipment, and even primitive night vision devices that were cutting-edge technology for 1986. He also carried a more powerful radio than typical hikers used and had arranged for twice-daily check-ins with the magazine's offices. When Williams failed to make his scheduled radio contact on October 23rd, search operations began immediately. Unlike previous cases, his employers were well connected and put pressure on park authorities to mount an extensive search effort. Within 24 hours, we had teams covering every trail and known camping area within a 10-mile radius of his last known position. We found his base camp on the second day of searching, and the scene was different from previous attacks. Williams had been prepared for trouble. His camp was set up in a more defensible position, his gear was arranged to allow for quick escape, and he had clearly been expecting some kind of confrontation. His tent showed evidence of hasty packing, as if he had been preparing to leave when the attack occurred. But most importantly, Williams had managed to deploy his motion-activated cameras before the attack. We found 4 devices hidden in trees around his campsite, all containing film that would revolutionize our understanding of what we were dealing with. The motion-activated photographs captured the entire attack sequence from multiple angles. The images showed that Williams had been confronted by at least 5 of the creatures, working together with sophisticated coordination that resembled military tactics. They had surrounded his camp from multiple directions, cutting off escape routes before moving in for the final assault. The creatures showed clear evidence of having learned from previous encounters. They approached Williams's camp more cautiously than they had approached Jack's, and they appeared to be actively looking for cameras and recording devices. The last photograph in the sequence showed Williams being overwhelmed by multiple creatures attacking simultaneously. The image was blurred by the violence of the motion, but it was clear that Williams had fought desperately before being overpowered. The Williams case marked the beginning of a systematic cover-up that extended far beyond the local park service. Within hours of discovering the motion-activated photographs, federal agents arrived at park headquarters and took control of the investigation. These weren't typical FBI agents or even Fish and Wildlife Service investigators. They were from an agency I didn't recognize, with credentials that identified them only as Department of Interior Special Investigations. All physical evidence from the Williams case was confiscated, including the motion-activated cameras, the photographs, and even our written reports of what we had found. We were required to sign new confidentiality agreements that were far more restrictive than anything we had been asked to sign previously. The penalties for discussing the case were severe, not just termination, but potential criminal prosecution under federal laws related to national security. The official story released to Williams' employers and the media was that he had suffered a fatal accident while attempting to photograph bears. His body had been recovered and transported to his family for burial, though of course no body had actually been found. When Williams' magazine editors pressed for more details, they were told that graphic photographs from the scene were too disturbing to release, and that further investigation might compromise ongoing wildlife management efforts in the park. But the cover-up went deeper than simply suppressing evidence. I learned from contacts in other national parks that similar incidents had been occurring throughout the Appalachian Mountain region for decades. Rangers in Shenandoah National Park, the Monongahela National Forest, and even remote areas of the Blue Ridge Parkway had been reporting encounters with creatures matching the same description. And in each case, the evidence had been confiscated, and the incidents officially attributed to bear attacks or hiking accidents. There appeared to be a coordinated federal effort to suppress any evidence of these creatures' existence. Scientists who attempted to study the evidence were transferred or lost their funding. Journalists who investigated the disappearances found their sources drying up, and their editors suddenly uninterested in the story. Even family members of victims were discouraged from asking too many questions through a combination of official intimidation and financial settlements that required them to sign non-disclosure agreements. The scope of the cover-up suggested that the federal government had known about these creatures for years, possibly decades, and had made a deliberate decision to keep their existence secret. The economic implications of acknowledging the presence of unknown predators in America's national parks would have been devastating, not just to tourism, but to the entire outdoor recreation industry that generated billions of dollars annually. More troubling was the possibility that the government wasn't just covering up the creatures' existence, but was actively studying them. The sophisticated equipment carried by the federal agents who took over the Williams investigation, their detailed knowledge of what to look for at the crime scenes, and their obvious familiarity with the creature's behavior patterns suggested that this wasn't their first encounter with such evidence. I began to suspect that we park rangers were being used as unwitting data collectors, gathering information about the creature's behavior and capabilities while being kept ignorant of the larger picture. Our reports, our photographs, and our first-hand observations were all being fed into some kind of classified research program that treated both the creatures and their human victims as subjects to be studied rather than a crisis to be resolved. Within weeks of Marcus Williams' disappearance and the discovery of the motion-activated photographs, I received notice of my transfer to a different section of the park, far from the Appalachian Trail corridor. When I attempted to discuss the case with my superiors, I was told in no uncertain terms that my overactive imagination was becoming a liability to the Park Service. The official report on Marcus Williams listed his disappearance as a probable fall from a cliff, despite the fact that his destroyed campsite was found in a valley nowhere near any significant drop-offs. The photographs from his motion-activated camera were confiscated and, according to my supervisor, lost during processing. It became clear that the Park Service had no intention of acknowledging what was killing hikers in the Great Smoky Mountains. The economic impact of admitting that an unknown predator was hunting humans in one of America's most popular national parks was simply too great. Tourism generated millions of dollars annually for the local economy. Acknowledging the presence of what could only be described as a Sasquatch-like creature would have been devastating. I submitted my resignation from the National Park Service in March 1987 and moved to Colorado, where I worked for the Forest Service until my retirement. But I never forgot what I had seen in those mountains or the hikers who had died because the truth was too inconvenient to acknowledge. Even after leaving the Park Service, I continued to monitor missing person reports from the Great Smoky Mountains area. The pattern continued with predictable regularity. Every year, typically in the late fall or early winter, one or two experienced hikers would vanish without a trace from the same general area of the Appalachian Trail. The official explanations remained consistent: bear attacks, falls, getting lost, equipment failure. Bodies were rarely recovered. Investigations were cursory. The media coverage, when it occurred at all, focused on the dangers of solo hiking and the need for proper preparation rather than questioning why so many experienced outdoors people were vanishing in the same small area. What frustrated me most was the knowledge that these deaths were preventable. A simple warning to hikers about the presence of an unknown predator in that area could have saved lives. Even without revealing the full truth, the Park Service could have implemented temporary trail closures or required hikers to travel in groups through the most dangerous sections. Instead, they chose to sacrifice hikers' lives to preserve the park's reputation and maintain tourism revenue. Despite the official cover-up, physical evidence of the creature's presence in the Great Smoky Mountains continues to accumulate. Every year, hikers report massive tracks, disturbed campsites, and encounters with something that doesn't match any known wildlife in the region. Most dismiss these experiences as bear encounters or let their imaginations run wild, but a few recognize that they have encountered something extraordinary. The creature appears to have learned from its mistakes. Recent disappearances show more sophisticated behavior, less evidence left behind, bodies completely removed from the area, camps destroyed in ways that more closely resemble bear activity. But the basic pattern remains the same: experienced solo hikers vanishing without a trace from the same section of the Appalachian Trail. I believe the creature responsible for Jack Morrison's death and the deaths of at least 16 other hikers that I know of is still active in the Great Smoky Mountains. It has learned to be more careful, more selective in its prey, and more thorough in eliminating evidence. But it hasn't stopped hunting. The truth about what happened to Jack Morrison in October 1985 died with him in that remote clearing, consumed by something that science refuses to acknowledge and bureaucracy refuses to confront. He was an experienced, careful, intelligent outdoorsman who did everything right, and it wasn't enough to save him from a predator that shouldn't exist. If you're planning to hike the Appalachian Trail through Great Smoky Mountains National Park, particularly the section between Newfound Gap and Fontana Dam, please consider these words carefully. Travel in groups of 3 or more. Avoid camping in isolated areas away from designated shelters. If you encounter massive tracks, unexplained sounds, or the feeling that you're being watched, leave the area immediately. The Park Service will tell you that the greatest dangers in the Smokies are black bears, sudden weather changes, and getting lost. They're lying. The greatest danger is something they refuse to acknowledge, something that has been hunting humans in those mountains for decades, while officials look the other way. Jack Morrison was a skilled, experienced hiker who knew the mountains better than most park rangers. He documented his stalker, followed proper safety procedures, and carried equipment that should have kept him safe in any normal circumstances. None of it mattered when he encountered something that was stronger, more intelligent, and more ruthless than anything supposed to exist in the eastern United States. His camera survived. His photographs remain locked away in some government archive, too dangerous to release to the public. But the creature that killed him is still out there, still hunting, still feeding on hikers who venture alone into the remote sections of America's most popular national park. The Park Service knows. They've always known. They just decided your life is worth less than their tourism revenue. Don't hike alone in the Great Smoky Mountains. Don't trust the official safety briefings. Don't assume that because something isn't supposed to exist, it can't kill you. Jack Morrison made that assumption in October 1985. His remains are still somewhere in those mountains, scattered across a feeding ground that the Park Service has worked very hard to keep hidden from the public. He deserved better than to become food for a monster that officially doesn't exist. We all do. If you're interested in more stories like this, check this one out.